Hello everyone and welcome to the teaching series. Hey, if you're watching this on its release date, tomorrow is Valentine's Day, so for all you dudes who forgot, you're welcome. Hey, this is a week we celebrate love. And what's also interesting about tomorrow is that it kicks off the season of Lent, which culminates with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, this epic picture of God's love for humanity to reconcile us to Him. So I thought it'd be really cool to look at a monumental story in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Older Testament, where God's extravagant love is on display. And it's not a story most of us would run to first. It's in Genesis chapter 15, but let's provide a little bit of context before we tackle our story today. Here is a graphic for the restoration of all things. This is a sermon I did on the entire Bible from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. It's 73 minutes long. It tackles how the Bible is just this massive unified story. And you can actually get a copy of this graphic in this form. I'll put it underneath the discussion questions, but it's also in the sermon library with the restoration of all things. But I've basically just kind of taken this graphic and reformatted it for easier viewing purposes for our teaching series. But we're going to be here today in Genesis chapter 15, and what has happened thus far is that God has created this amazing world, and humanity just shattered it to pieces with sin in Genesis chapter 3. And then God puts this plan in place for the restoration of all things, and the plan really picks up steam in Genesis chapter 12 when God comes to a man by the name of Abram, who will later be called Abraham. And he says, Abram, I want you to leave your country and your father's household and go to the land that I will show you. He's basically saying leave land and family, the two most important values in the ancient world for these tribal society people. And God says, I will bless you, and then the whole world is going to be blessed through you. And what's fascinating is God literally starts this conversation and says, Abram, I want you to walk. And a few verses later it says, and Abram walked. And the question becomes, where did God call him from? Where was he calling him to? Well, on a map here, he's in Ur of the Chaldeans. He'll go all the way up to Haran, and then from Haran, he'll end up into the land of Canaan. Now, you look at this and you go, that seems far. Yes, it is. Here are the modern countries overlaid. So he goes through Iraq, through Syria, into Turkey, back through Syria, through Jordan, and into what is the land of Israel today. And by the way, he's doing so at the pace of sheep and goats. Now, what's interesting about this whole story is that in Hebrews, it tells us that Abram didn't even know where he was going. He just faithfully walked, and what a walk it was. This amazing picture of obedience. Well, a couple of events happen once he gets into the land, and he goes off to Egypt for a bit, and he's now back in the land. But when we come to Genesis 15, we have a huge problem on our hands. God has promised land and family. Abram is in the land, but he doesn't possess it. But what's even more disconcerting for him is he has no child. And he calls God out on it. So in the beginning of chapter 15, he's calling God out on that. God goes, no, you will have flesh and blood to pass on your heritage to. And Abram believes God, and it's this really great moment. But then we come to this verse in chapter 15, verse 7. God also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Now, this word know here in Hebrew is the word yada. And it, yes, means to know, but for our purposes, what's helpful to understand is that this is an experiential knowledge. And what I mean by that is that in the Bible, knowledge is not something that is abstract. It is always connected to an experience. So when Abram says to God, how will I know? He's saying, God, what experience can you give me so that I know you'll make due on your promise? And God's like, you want an experience, Abram? All right, buddy, buckle up. Here we go. And this is how it continues in verse 9. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all of these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Now, God never told Abram to cut these animals in half, and yet Abram does it. And the question is, why? Well, this is where we really need to dig into our cultural lens. Now, this graphic might look familiar to many of you. If you've had a chance to download the free ebook, it's in there and it's explained. And this is the approach that we're taking for taking a text like Genesis 15 and sticking it into its context and the 6 lenses with which we need to look at the Bible through in order to understand the way that it was intended. We've already tackled a little bit of the literary, setting Genesis 15 in the larger narrative. We've looked a little bit linguistic with the word yada. We're going to look at another word in just a few moments. Geographical, the map, where is he coming from? Where did God call him from? But this is the big one for helping us understand what's going on here in Genesis chapter 15. And what's helpful is that there's actually a passage in the scriptures that gives us a bit of the cultural background to what's going on here. This is from Jeremiah 34:18. God is speaking. He says, "Those who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces." Now, we'll come back to this in just a moment. Notice covenant shows up twice here. This is the word in Hebrew, berit, means covenant. But the word berit comes from the Hebrew verb bara, which means to separate or to cut. So when you have this idea of a covenant, which is this deep relationship that two parties entered into, it was often ratified with a covenant cutting ceremony. Okay, try saying that 10 times fast. And what this is that you would take an animal or animals, you would divide them in half. Most likely you'd put them in a place where the blood would be able to pool down together, and you create this blood path, and then both parties in the covenant agreement would walk through it as a symbolic way of saying, listen, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, you can do to me what we've done to these animals, i.e., I will pay for this with my life, with my own blood. Now, I love what Sandra Richter in her book, The Epic of Eden, says with how God is utilizing this ceremony with Abram. She writes this: "Here Yahweh condescends to Abram's humanity by choosing a means of warranty that had currency in Abram's world." And what she's saying here is that God enters into the cultural reality and utilizes something that Abram already understands the weight and significance of. It has currency in his world. And so God says, these are the animals that I want. And this is why Abram just cuts them in half, because he understands exactly what's going on because of how God chose to use something he already knew. And then this is how it continues in verse 12. "As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep." I'm not going to throw this up, but this is tardema in Hebrew. The first time it shows up is in Genesis chapter 2 when God puts Adam to sleep in order to create Eve. So if you're reading this like Hebrew, you're going, oh my goodness, another epic moment is coming because this phrase is being used. And then it says, "And a thick and dreadful darkness came over him." Now there's a couple ways that you can understand this thick and dreadful darkness. There are connections to ancient texts that this is somehow maybe representation of God's presence showing up. It can also be understood that Abram is freaked out of his mind. I mean, if you said to the living God of the universe, hey, what kind of an experience can you give me? And God goes, how about we cut a covenant? And you know, if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, like you lose your life, you pay for it in your own blood, I think you'd be freaked out as well. And I think maybe both of these kind of aspects are here. And so you've got this moment where Abram goes into this deep sleep, which is not like a conventional sleep. So he seems to be aware and alert. It's just a word that's taking us back to Genesis chapter 2, and then God is doing something here similar to back then, this new creation kind of reality. And then God explains in the next few verses how he's going to make good on his promise. And then we come to the epic moment in the story. Verse 17, "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Now, what's interesting about the smoking firepot and the blazing torch is this represented particular deities in the Mesopotamian world, which is where Abram came from. And in this story, it represents the presence of God walking through the pieces. Now, this is a covenant. Both parties are to walk it. Notice what happens next. Verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant, there's our word, with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. And then the story ends. And you go, but wait a minute. Abram never walked between the pieces. Exactly! That's what's absolutely astounding about this story. And when you step back, you go, okay, so what does this mean? It means that God prevented Abram from walking between the pieces because what God was saying to Abram was this: Abram, I'm the kind of God who not only walks between the pieces, but I will walk both ends of this covenant. I'm not going to let down my end, but I'm going to let you know that if you or your descendants do not uphold your end of the bargain, I will pay for it in my own blood. And it's in this moment that the fate of Jesus Christ dying is sealed. Because God says to Abram, this whole storyline where I'm going to redeem and restore all things is not going to be contingent upon your faithfulness. It will be contingent upon mine, and I will make sure that humanity experiences the full restoration of all things. Oh, isn't that incredible? Now, for Abram, he doesn't know where the storyline is going. He doesn't know anything about Jesus. So let's just park for a few moments here. In the ancient world, the gods and goddesses were understood to be detached from human experience. They didn't really care about humans. And if anything negative happened in the human world, it was understood that the gods were angry. And so people were always sacrificing anything and everything they could to try to appease the wrath of the gods and to bend their attention in good favor towards them. Now, God will later on institute a sacrificial system, but it's revolutionary in how God does it because he lets the people know that they can be in right relationship with him. Because the rest of the people with their gods and goddesses, they never knew where they stood. And so it's like in this moment, Abram is met with the reality that this God is unlike any other God. And God says to Abram, listen, I understand that people sacrifice for the gods, but what you need to understand about me is that I am a God who fundamentally sacrifices for you because I'm willing to walk between the pieces. And this is a giant leap forward in the consciousness of humanity about how you relate to the divine. This was revolutionary for Abram to understand. And it was like God saying, Abram, I need you to get your mind bigger. Don't limit me. Like, allow yourself to recognize that I am infinitely bigger than what you think or understand. And I believe that has a word for us as well. But now as we think about too, like, let's look at the story a little bit further down. One of the conversations that I have with people a lot is that people will say to me, Brad, I read the scriptures and man, God just seems so angry and just wrathful and it's got the short fuse and he's all pent up in the Old Testament. And then Jesus comes along and he's like patient and loving and kind. And they're like, what's up with that? And I immediately go, oh, we have to re-understand these stories from the Older Testament because this is not the fundamental reality of who God is. Indeed, Jesus even refutes this in the New Testament when Jesus will say in John 14:9, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Or in another place, he'll say, I and the Father are one, which Jesus is the exact representation of who God is. In fact, this is how Hebrews begins. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. And so it's not like somehow God changes between the Testaments. It's like, no, I think we need to understand the stories in the Hebrew Scriptures a little bit better, because this is what Jesus says about the Father. And when we recognize that when it comes to the life of Jesus, and we even talk about passages like, right, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, that he gave his only Son, that at the root of everything God is doing is love. And that when Jesus goes to a cross, this isn't anything new. He's not creating a new storyline. He's just carrying the storyline to its fulfillment. And it began all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, when God creates the world out of love. And then humanity drives it into the ground. And in love, God goes, we're going to restore this whole thing. And he puts his plan in place, and he comes to Abram. And in Genesis 15, he says, Abram, you need to understand that at the core of who I am is a God of love who will sacrifice on your behalf. And this carries the whole storyline through, so that when we do get to the cross and to the empty tomb, what we celebrate at the end of this season of Lent is this reality that God has loved humanity from day one, and this is a God who is willing to sacrifice for us. And I believe that that's just the novelty of Genesis 15 and the whole storyline, is that God is inviting us to be reminded in some ways, and in other ways just to be met with the reality that he's infinitely bigger than what we think. That at the core of everything he does is love, that he's aware of our lives. He loves us dearly. He is not distant and detached, but he is present, and he's drawing us to himself, and he wants us to experience this restoration and wholeness, and to not get caught in these little confined boxes of a little God, but allow our minds to be blown wide open to the immense reality of who God is. And that's the Genesis 15 story in its context, and I hope it has an extreme impact upon you and your relationship with God. So there we go. Thank you for watching this teaching. If you're not watching this at walkingthetext.com, head over there. There are discussion questions. You can leave comments. If you know someone who just needs to hear this teaching, share that with them. Again, thank you for watching, and may you walk out the text well in your life.